Last weekend, there was a Let Kids Be rally at Queen's Park in Toronto. It was hosted by the Association for Reform Political Action, and it featured a crowd of people who were protesting sex changes for children, which is something that happens in Canada, even as the UK moves away from this, even as many American states move away from this, even as many European medical establishments decide that this is actually an experimental horror show. In Canada, this consensus is largely unchallenged, at least from inside the establishment. And so here's a clip of what that rally looked like. So obviously this rally is just objectively a very good thing. You've got people who care about vulnerable kids showing up on a Saturday at the government building to protest against actions that are currently supported by the government and urging the Ontario government to do what Premier Danielle Smith did in Alberta, which is to draft and pass legislation protecting children from these experimental medical procedures. And I think the CBC coverage here is actually worth taking a look at. I was reading through the different coverage of this event. I myself was in the UK, so I couldn't attend myself, or I would have. But CBC's coverage is just a masterclass in propaganda. And the coverage of this event is significant because it shows how this sort of very insular, airtight narrative is being maintained in Canada, even as the debate rages in all these other Western countries. So I'm going to read through a bit of the CBC coverage with you just to highlight the ways that they try to uphold this consensus, disallow debate, and then even tell multiple lies within the context of their article. So it starts with a rally at Queen's Park in Toronto Saturday against gender-affirming care for youth in Ontario was met by a counter-protest organized by trans rights activists who said they were there to combat misinformation and protect what they say is essential health care. That is a very long lead sentence. The whole paragraph is one sentence, and you'll notice that in the lead paragraph you have gender-affirming care, which is trans ideological language to basically say you're affirming the gender the person feels like on the inside. And so the premises are baked right into the phrase, and so you can tell just a few words in to the first paragraph of this coverage that they are there to rebut the rally. That even though it's CBC, it's the state broadcaster, they're supposed to have at least a pretense of neutrality, they're not even going to pretend. And the main characters are immediately laid out too. You've got the antagonist and the protagonist. And the protagonist here is the trans activists who are there to combat misinformation and protect essential health care. And so then they say opposing chants echoed across the Queen's Park lawn with dozens of people on both sides separated by the police. They note that ARPA was calling for an end to gender-affirming care for minors, which sounds pretty sinister, doesn't it, when you word it like that, including puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and genital surgery. So they quote Danielle Zechfeld, a policy analyst with ARPA, saying, "We believe we need to let kids be to grow and develop naturally without medical gender transitions," a position that would have been considered common sense and held by everybody 20 years ago. And then the counter-protest, now we've moved to the protagonist section of the article here from CBC, was put together in response by organizers from the Trans Rights Commission of Toronto. I bet that they're government funded. They said the Let Kids Be Kids rally was spreading misinformation about gender-affirming care for youth, which they called essential care. That's twice in 4 paragraphs, which were reminded this essential care, which barely ever happens, is in fact essential. Counter-protesters pushed back on a number of ARPA's claims, including that minors were undergoing genital surgery in Canada. Currently, lower or bottom genital surgery are only available to people 18 and older by federal law. In rare cases, professionals say older teens can be eligible for chest or top surgery, but only after they've been in care for a significant time and have had thorough medical consultation. Now, this is actually just not the case. And if I move here to a National Post article now, from 2023. They reported that on September 29, 2023, here's the headline: hundreds of trans teens under 18 have had breasts removed in Canada, new data shows. And here's just 2 paragraphs from this article that highlights that the thing that ARPA is protesting here is a thing that is actually happening, which is the cue for those who support it to pivot to saying, okay, fine, it's happening quite a bit, but in fact, it's essential healthcare. Hospitalizations and day surgery visits for bilateral mastectomies for gender reassignment surgery have risen sharply from 536 in 2018-19 to 985 in fiscal year 2022-2023, according to data compiled for the National Post by the Canadian Institute for Health Information. Of the 4,071 visits in total involving gender-affirming mastectomies or breast reductions reported since 2018, 602 involved youth 18 and under. Of those, 303 involved teens 17 and under. The youngest was 14 years old. The numbers tell only part of the story because the CIHI data exclude Quebec hospitals, as well as surgeries performed in private clinics like the McLean Clinic in Mississauga, which describes its surgeons as industry pioneers for top surgery, mastectomies and breast reductions in those assigned female at birth, and breast augmentation for those born transitioning male to female. One specialist in transgender health issues said that when applying for OHIP funding for people seeking top surgery, 50 to 70% will go to McLean's. So that means that of the hundreds noted here by the National Post, there's many more that don't actually show up in the data. And so I could give you a lot more information here. We can drop that in a link, but this is just evidence, again, on the record evidence that the claims being made here are wrong, but that doesn't stop them from saying it loudly and into microphones. Lisa Delcal, professor of Toronto PFLAG, never heard of that group, said she joined the counter-protest, again, to help dispel misinformation. Now, wouldn't that be nice? Parents are out here because they're scared. Some of them are scared because they're getting the wrong information. They don't know what it means for their kids, and so they push back understandably. The rest of us, the other parents, we're out here because we're afraid of the backlash that's coming from that disinformation. Now, just another comment here, because the gaslighting here is insane. Parents are concerned that their children are being socially transitioned and in some cases physically transitioned at schools without their knowledge. And their response is to say, you just don't understand the situation. And the assertion is basically that gender-affirming care is essential health care. It doesn't do anything bad to anybody. And one of the ways you can dispel this, if you want to have nightmares, you should go to Reddit and go to the r/dtrans thread, which is just packed with young people who underwent gender-affirming care as teenagers and are now suffering horribly. I've read a lot of these over the last couple of months, especially. A number of them have actually ended up going viral. There's kids saying that their sexual function is gone, that their health has almost collapsed in the wake of these surgeries, that people aren't super interested in helping them out when their bodies have essentially been ruined by the surgeries that were just described as having taken place in Canada. And I just saw one recently. Let me read you just a paragraph here from one of the recent testimonies. Lying in bed right now, crying my eyes out and my regret over my mastectomy I had 3 years ago at age 18. Grief is hitting me so bleeping bad about my voice, about my face, about my scars, and about the fact that I had an oophorectomy at 18 and didn't even get at the time what that word meant. I began HRT, hormone replacement therapy, at 15. These are the puberty blockers that they're defending so hard. I want to know what my life would have been like if I had not done this. I'm trying to desensitize myself to it all by spending time in transgender-focused spaces, but it's only making the grief more prominent, and it's probably re-traumatizing me. I don't know. I regret it so bad. I'm so bleeping sorry. I'm so sorry. There are thousands of these messages. This is what parents are actually afraid of. This is what these surgeries and puberty blockers and hormone replacement therapy are doing to kids before we let them vote or buy cigarettes or drive a car or have a drink. And so it's just, I wish the trans activists who showed up were actually there to combat misinformation, but in fact, they were there to purvey it. And you don't even just have to take my word for it. I recognize that there are going to be people watching this who say, well, whatever, he's a Christian, he's a social conservative, and so of course he holds those views. Well, the National Health Service of the UK is certainly not Christian or social conservative. The Labor government, which upheld and made permanent the temporary ban on puberty blockers, certainly isn't either. The medical establishments across Europe in post-Christian secular countries who are essentially calling this an ongoing medical experiment on minors are not Christian or social conservative either. So ask yourself why it's just in Canada that we cannot have a debate. And when you have people show up at an ARPA rally to protest these practices, that the state broadcaster takes care to present them as sort of fringe extremists who don't know what they're talking about. And so that was the general drift of the entire CBC article. I could read more about it, but it mainly focuses on a ton of different interviews with the counter-protesters. One of the counter-protesters pointed as an example of misinformation to the Let Kids Be rally website, which says, doctors should never cut off healthy body parts from patients whose brains have not fully developed and who are too young to vote or buy alcohol. They're talking about cutting body parts off children, which is not happening, she said. So a lot of their arguments are based on lies. They're anti-science and anti-human rights. Let's go back to the National Post headline here again. What did they say? Hundreds of trans teens under 18 have had breasts removed in Canada, new data show. What do you think removed means? What do you think a double mastectomy does? These healthy body parts are being surgically removed. So yes, their breasts are being cut off, as horrifying as that is to consider. I wish this was misinformation. I find conspiracy theories on the internet incredibly annoying, as anybody who follows me knows. I wish this was a conspiracy theory that we could debunk and say, man, I'm sure glad that's not happening. But unfortunately, it is happening. It's government policy, and it's backed by not only the state broadcaster, but most of the mainstream press, as the coverage of ARPA's event so clearly highlighted. And so one counter-protester who wished only to be identified as A carried signs reading, "Don't be your child's first bully, and this is Christian nationalism." That quote, which is the closing quote that CBC chose, is again worth mentioning because the term Christian nationalism, as I said in the recent episode on Charlie Kirk, it's a totally useless phrase. Because Christian nationalism, a lot of people think, means some sort of pseudo-fascist movement where people are attempting to impose their morality on a whole country. And I would point out that everybody's imposing their morality when they do politics. But that aside, policies that were once just the norm right across the country for everybody on every corner of the political spectrum is now Christian nationalism. And so the term basically means nothing. And it's a shut-up term for these people are scary, don't listen to them. Now, I'll close the ARPA segment here with one little clip that I think, again, is significant. Here is a very classic clip that so often unfolds at events like these. I've been to many of them. I've seen similar incidents unfold more times than I can count. Here are, and note this, a bunch of white trans activists insulting and attacking a bunch of black cops.
Why is it not on? Yeah, now don't touch civilians. That's illegal. Right? No. Get off the road. You actually didn't have to all kinds of okay. What's your battle number?
So look at the way those cops were treated by those trans activists. What's so interesting at all these rallies, and again, I've seen lots of trans activists at rallies before. They've come to pro-life events as well, and I've been to multiple different events. And in every instance, I'd like you to note the difference between those who showed up at ARPA's rally and those who are protesting the rally. Who are the cops there for? The cops are there to get in between the counter-protesters and the protesters, but they're not there to make sure the protesters don't go after the trans activists. They're there because the trans activists want to go after the protesters. Same thing as with pro-life marches. They're there to protect those protesting from the very people who, as you'll see in this next clip, like to call their opponents fascists. Take a look at this.
Go home, fascists! Go home, fascists! Go home, fascists! Go home, fascists! Go home, fascists!
Now, what is the mark of a fascist? A fascist, very famously, would use street violence, often wearing masks to enforce their political ideology on others. Street violence is a mark of fascist movements, which people who read history books would be aware of. And so this, again, it's another form of role reversal. It's another form of gaslighting, is you need cops at a rally of protesters who want to protect vulnerable children, and then there are those who are claiming you're attacking us as vulnerable people, you are the fascists, yet the police need to be here to protect you from us. And this plays out over and over and over again. I'll leave one final thought about the CBC coverage in general. And again, it's fantastic that this rally actually happened. It's very important that this kind of thing happens in Canada, because in Canada it seems to be so hard to get this debate open. Is the CBC did two things, as I noted before. They first claimed this is either barely happening or not happening at all, but then they're also saying this is essential healthcare. And when they make the point of, well, bottom surgeries are basically not happening at all in Canada, let's look at what puberty blockers actually do. And I'm not going to give you a in-depth description, but Abigail Schreier in her book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, details what puberty blockers and what hormone replacement therapy does to the genitals of young girls and young boys. Perhaps I can use one example without getting too explicit. If you look at Jazz Jennings, the young boy who identified as a girl and was transitioned young, they didn't give him a full bottom surgery, a castration, until later. But it went really badly, because essentially what happened was the puberty blockers they stuck him on as a minor shrunk his genitals so much that there wasn't even enough material left to use for the vaginoplasty, which is to create a neovagina. And he has undergone surgery after surgery after surgery. This is exactly why countries like the United Kingdom have banned puberty blockers for minors. And so you'll notice it's a bait and switch. Well, they're not actually performing castrations. Well, if that's 100% true, they are still doing procedures that they're defending as essential healthcare that badly mutilate and deform these minors, often beyond all recognition, as evidenced by perhaps the most famous trans child in the world, who not only has a book, I Am Jazz, that is recommended reading in schools right across Canada, but who was the star of his own reality show that millions of people have watched and has been used as a vehicle to mainstream the very treatments that ARPA was protesting. And so it takes real guts to do the bait and switch that the CBC is doing, but even their coverage of ARPA's event kind of gave a glimpse into why this debate has been so difficult to have in this country. Thank you all for listening. We hope you found the commentary helpful. And if you did, please do like the video, drop a comment in the comment section to engage in the conversation. We're always interested in hearing your thoughts. And of course, if you found it helpful, please do share the video on whatever platforms that you are on. You can also find this show wherever else you download your podcast content. Thanks again so much for watching.